Hey everyone, welcome back to Crossing the Valley. My guests today are a couple of old friends, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Burns and Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Ritzema. They're joining us again from Europe, from Germany, where they just completed the Arcane Thunder exercise. You may remember a few weeks ago we talked to them before the exercise about the 2nd Multi-Domain Task Force and the Multi-Domain Effects Brigade and all that they were looking to learn over this nearly month-long exercise. Today we caught up with them to hear about how it went, what it means for the future of the organization, and what it means for the future of warfare in Europe. Enjoy.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the U.S. Department of Defense each year, but so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the Valley of Death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now. I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley.
All right, guys, welcome back. I am excited to be back together with Aaron Ritzema, Tommy Burns, fresh off the Arcane Thunder exercise. Lots to talk about in terms of the technologies you all used in the conduct of a series of CONUS and different objectives over the last couple of weeks, really the last month. Gentlemen, thanks first off for coming back and being willing to share with us what you learned.
Yeah, we appreciate it. I think we're pretty excited with kind of how the exercise went overall. Really excited to kind of dive into this with you, talk about what we learned, and then just kind of scope out what's next and what's on the horizon for us.
Awesome. So let's do it. Basically, as I understand it, two primary portions to the exercise. There was the European theater, and then there was a CONUS or a U.S. side piece of the exercise as well. Let's start with what happened in Europe, in Poland. Let's just take it kind of one at a time. Talk about the maybe the sensor to shooter connections that you all were testing out, and kind of what you put forward and what you learned.
Yeah, so for the sensor to shooter piece, two kind of elements to that. So the first one, and I think we kind of talked about this a little bit in our first session with you, was using our homemade UAS inside of our innovation lab, or the Forge as we call it, with a sensing EW payload on it, and then being able to tie that back into our mission command environment, and then eventually pass that on to a kinetic shooter. So that piece was in terms of the digital architecture and the signal flow, that was successful. Getting it to happen while the homemade UAS stayed in the air, a little bit more of a challenge, and I can talk a little bit more about that. Some good lessons learned there. And then when we talk, kind of NATO and joint integration, we were able to bring in some USVs from the Navy's Task Force 66 that then provided the sensing for another sensor to shooter thread. And so really, in both of those scenarios, I think very successful in proving out the digital signal flow on that, and then the process flow. And then I think some room for improvement and evaluation in terms of where we want to take our homegrown UAS program. While we were doing all of that, we also had elements from the 2nd Cavalry Regiment co-located with us, and they kind of worked us through some of their FPV drone programs that they have, both from an operational standpoint. They brought up a mobile printing lab that they essentially have. So it was really interesting to see how they're kind of conceptualizing additive manufacturing at the tactical edge. How does that feed into their concept of employment? And then they also had an individual from their fires squadron that was there, kind of more in line with what we're looking at in terms of how do we actually create some sort of deep sensing capability, and then be able to use that to drive effects and fire speed. So that whole piece, I think, overall we'll give ourselves a passing grade on that, but I think there's, some things that we'll take back and kind of analyze in terms of the homegrown UAS side.
Okay, well, break it down a little bit. You give yourself a passing grade. That's cool. We're glad to hear that. What goes into that calculation? Does that mean that most of the stuff you tried worked? Does that mean that you understand why some of the things you tried failed? Like how do you get to that calculation?
Yeah, so everything worked except for the consistency of the UAS flights. And so some of the lessons learned on this, it was actually really interesting to watch this kind of play out. So the first day that we took the UAS out, and if you recall back to our previous conversation, this was kind of model 2. The first model was just a pusher UAS that had one motor on it. And we were 0 for 3 on launches. Turned around and decided to come up with a VTOL model that had 3 motors, 1 motor in the back, 2 motors in the front, that essentially it rises up in a VTOL fashion, and then it transitions to forward flight with the 2 front motors rotating 90 degrees so that they can then provide kind of the forward power for that. So the first test flight that we did, we ended up elevating to around 100 feet above ground level. And as we did that, one of the motors burnt out, and then the whole UAS kind of tipped over, caught some air, so then it got some lift and went soaring off into a tree. And so as we kind of did the forensics on that and kind of like worked through what went wrong, what we determined was that basically we went too high before we started to transition to VTOL. And so it put a little bit more load on the motors than they were designed to handle. And so one of them basically flamed out. So subsequent flights from then on basically have that kind of initial elevation rise that we did before we tipped over into VTOL. And so once we did that, we were able to get 2 fairly successful and fairly lengthy flights, albeit not necessarily tied into the sensor to shooter piece because we hadn't integrated with the Polish firing battery at that point. Then the wind started to pick up, and so then we started to kind of fight through some weather considerations. And then we ended up crashing another one because we tried to overcompensate in terms of which direction we pointed the UAS. And then we finally got one more successful flight on the back end, kind of ironing out some of the procedural kinks and then also some of the technical kinks. And so all in all, I think it was around 4 attempted flights, and we had probably around 12 minutes of sustained flight time in that. And then that kind of happened independently. And then once we got to the point where the sensor to shooter thread with the Polish firing battery was ready to go live, we had basically kind of culminated in terms of our ability to do UAS ops. Though we were able to use the actual payload itself, still integrated into the UAS, just sitting on the ground versus being up in the air. So in terms of like proving out the logical flow, I think that's where the passing grade comes from, because we were able to hit all those gates and pass that targeting data back up through our higher headquarters and then pass that across to a NATO partner. So really proving out that NATO integration piece. But from having accomplished everything we sought to accomplish in that entire CONOP from kind of start to finish, not an A+, because we weren't able to do it while the UAS was airborne.
Awesome, detailed, appreciate the laydown there. Let me ask, I know we covered this a little bit the last time, but I want to just emphasize it. I think it's important. You all part of this was testing the homemade drones, and tell us why you thought it was important to test homemade, homegrown UAVs versus, off-the-shelf capability that comes from industry.
Yeah, so for us, the biggest reason is really the training component of it. And we'll talk this more when we kind of talk the Fort Huachuca, Arizona CONUS piece, because in that vignette, we brought in some actual commercial capability to do both the training and then also the testing. But part of what we're looking for while we're waiting for these long-term programs of record to show up and really fill out our kit is something that I can use in maybe a smaller operational space, but something I can use to test and train my EW operators and my aviation operators on how to do combined operations. And so some of that, I think we talked a little bit about last time as well, was the virtual training environment that we've spun up so that we could put those EW operators next to those UAS operators in a virtual training environment. And really, for me, the 3D printing of the UAS is just an extension of that. It gives me a little bit more live capability to play with. I think long-term, maybe there's, some assessment of where these fit in a truly operational capability based on some of the lessons learned we're looking in Ukraine. But for me right now, the main priority is just getting some training kit in my hands that I can actually use while I wait for the next Arcane Thunder to occur, where I have another influx of commercial capability.
Roger, makes sense. And I think it's a good laydown. Anything else to talk about that kind of that sensor to shooter tie with those homemade drones? Anything on this specific thread that you all want to talk about in terms of like what comes next, or based on the results of this one, the test that you want to run in the next exercise?
Yeah, so for the homegrown drone piece specifically, there's a couple things we talked about in terms of being the next step. One is changing our fabrication model. So right now, fully 3D printed. I think there's a case for us to actually start moving more towards like a mold strategy where we're actually 3D printing molds and then we pour in whatever material we're going to use. That also offers some options in terms of building larger drones. One of the other things we're looking at too, and this is something First MDTF has experimented with, is you can basically buy prefabricated kits. They're a little bit more expensive than what we can build, but still cheaper than buying a commercial capability. And so you basically buy the kit, you fab up a Class 2 plus UAS, and then you're actually able to start getting even more realistic training that kind of pushes us closer to where our operational use case is. So those are a couple things we're going to look at as we have our eye on Arcane Thunder 26.
And I think you also have the piece of, and I think 2CR was a big assist here too, on stressing like how far forward can we push the manufacturing? Can we do it, in an austere environment? Can we do it mobile? And I think we're going to try to take a shot at that next time too.
Love it. Just strong roadmap, lots to continue to advance the ball. Very cool. Great. Let's move to the second portion of the European exercise, which is the defensive cyber operations CONOP. Again, remind everybody kind of what were you trying to test? What did you do, and what did you learn?
So for the defensive cyber operations, this one was really oriented around two different things. So one of them was a subject matter exchange with our Polish partners. So bringing them in, giving them a course, and then kind of walking them through how we actually conduct defensive cyber operations. And then there was kind of a more scenario-based element of this where we just trained our team, our mission element, on how they also do defensive cyber operations. There was a virtual training environment tool that we were able to get through U.S. Army Europe and Africa. Shows a lot of promise. And so we were able to basically create a custom virtualized network, tie that to some other applications that can do threat replication on that. And so that really drove kind of that subject matter exchange with our Polish counterpart. So it's really interesting to kind of trade, TTP, techniques, tactics, and procedures with them in terms of how we actually process this. And then it was fun to kind of watch the mission element work their way through their paces. There was another planning element that basically was teeing up all these injects. And so then as they kind of talked through at the end, one, how do you identify malicious activity on your network? Two, what do you do about it once you've identified it? All inside the protection of this virtual training environment, they're able to work through all the different steps. And then the opposing force that was kind of running the scenario for them got, a little more aggressive as the exercise went on, and was able to start moving laterally across the network. And so being able to actually see all of that play out in the same tools that our teams use to monitor live networks was really good to see as they started to really kind of validate their processes, and then also validate that the soldiers have been completely trained and are ready to execute defensive cyber operations.
Awesome. What was the assessment? What did you guys think?
So we ended up coming out, and this one was a little more precise in terms of, you asked on the UAS, like, how did you assess that? So this one actually falls pretty squarely under, the Army has mission essential tasks, and then underneath that you have supporting collective tasks, and the Army's done a pretty good job for each of those, really kind of hammering out what these different criteria are that you need to do to assess that you're actually trained at whatever that task is. So inside the defensive cyber operations team, there's a couple tasks, there's a couple checklists that we go through. And then really just as they're kind of executing their operations, we had an external evaluator there that was just with the clipboard kind of clicking yes, no, yes, no. And so overall, the Army basically says, there's 3 different levels that you could potentially be trained at, the highest being T, trained, P, proficient is kind of that middle one, and then U being untrained. So being able to kind of really put us, we were probably, I think as we analyzed everything of the subtasks, we were able to get, probably about 80% of them to that highest standard. And so there was one or two tasks that we'll take for kind of retraining as we look at what our train up programs look like. So overall, again, I'd give it a strong pass. Still room for improvement on some of the other areas.
Very cool. The precision is neat. Did you guys have a goal going in for the target for the overall team, or was it just kind of like hey, let's see what it is?
So we kind of had broad stroke scenario dubbed out for them, and then it was really that opposing force that kind of put some meat behind the scenario and actually started rolling out the different injects that came along with that. And so then it was really just like, how do they respond once they've shown a certain level of proficiency? Then we started to kind of escalate that a little bit more as we worked our way through that.
Very cool. So based on the results that time, defensive cyber operations is obviously it's dynamic. It's not necessarily a linear progression, whereas some of the drone stuff you were laying out is like, okay, we did X, now we can do X plus Y. How do you think about kind of evolving the experimentation around defensive cyber ops, or how might the CONUP or the test or the experiment evolve in the next exercise?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I want to do with this mission area is actually replicate what our network looks like in a virtual environment, and then train our teams on how to defend our actual network in that virtual environment. So for this scenario, it was a fairly stock, fairly unsophisticated network architecture that we put the teams on. But I think the value in being able to actually train on the network in a virtual environment that they're actually going to be asked to defend in real life is just immense. And then being a little bit more robust with some of the threat pieces that we can bring in. There's opportunities for other NATO and joint partners to kind of join us on that. And so I think that's where we kind of add complexity, but then also move it towards a little bit more of a realistic scenario for future iterations.
Cool. Love it. Awesome. Well, let's bring us into the third kind of line of effort then, or third kind of the contested logistics piece of the exercise. Walk us through again, kind of what did you want to test? How'd you go about it? What'd you learn?
So this one was, I'm probably going to get yelled at for the way that I characterize this later when people start listening to this, but this was the more it's kind of a stretch goal, and it's kind of more of an opportunity for me to integrate my brigade support company into the scheme of operations that was going on. So really, the way that scenario played out doesn't necessarily stress any of their realistic tasks that they're going to be asked to do. We kind of, worked some of the scenarios, so it simulated them, handing off either supplies or receiving supplies because they're not able to get them, and that's where the whole kind of contested piece came from. It wasn't contested in the sense that the beach was crawling with enemy and they had to fight their way through it. More of a strategic contested logistics scenario. How are we moving supplies around in the Baltic? And so for them, it was really good to just kind of watch them do some kind of more basic soldier tasks, warrior task and battle drills, just kind of work through, dismounted movements, how they pull security for themselves. So fairly basic. To an infantryman, it'd be very basic task, but it was good for them to get out, kind of do the team building activity side of things. One of the biggest challenges with the USVs, though, and it's kind of one of the interesting lessons learned really all around for Arcane Thunder is just a lot of impact from weather, both from our airborne capacity, but even from our seaborne capacity. And so as they worked their way through the training progression on this, we ended up actually executing the full-on contested logistics vignette inside the port versus out in the ocean, because we were getting some fairly significant swells. So we kind of made the safety call to do that. I think long-term, there's still, a lot of space to explore here with Task Force 66. And, as they continue their experimentation on unmanned surface vehicles, and there's a couple different models they have, I think continuing to partner with them and push both the contested logistics piece forward, but then as we kind of alluded to in the sensor to shooter piece, there's a lot that they can bring into that as well. And so I think, the soldiers enjoyed getting out there and doing, the thing that they signed up to do when they became a soldier. And so in that sense, it was a success, but I don't know, in terms of proving out our concept of employment or really getting after any of our specific training tasks, we didn't really go down that road.
Got it. So then how does that evolve based on what you did see and what you did learn? Well, first off, let's assess performance. What did you think overall based on what you did see?
I mean, overall, it was very good. So one of their senior NCOs that was taking charge of the training special operations background, has done a lot of different interesting things. And so they were rolling on these foot marches fairly often and fairly, they started to add complexity. They did some during the day, then they did some at night, then they started doing road marches associated with it, which is just basically marching, without vehicles, some dismounted marches. And so they kind of worked their way through all the movement pieces. One of the things that we started to kind of work on, and this is where I would want to kind of take this scenario further. So in the future, I'd want them to actually use the vehicles that they would actually use to do distribution ops with. But then there's an opportunity to integrate them with the other pieces of the battalion, whether it's, we have sensors on platforms that are providing, some sort of overwatch for them as they're moving from one objective to the next. What we've got, some of our defensive EW capabilities where we can do baselines of the EMS environment and help them for looking at any threats out there while they're doing those movements. So I think really the long-term piece is how do I give them the task that's specific to what they're actually going to be asked to do, and then how do I integrate that into the larger battalion?
Any thoughts on how you're going to actually build an exercise around some of that on the next one?
I would say it's probably too soon to tell on that one.
Got it. Awesome. Anyone want to? So maybe now that we've kind of gone through the 3 lines of effort around the European effort. Do we want to just kind of maybe zoom out for a second and say, so each of those obviously we kind of gone through individually. If you think about the effort as a holistic, from a holistic perspective, how do you grade it? Like, what do you think were the big takeaways from this exercise, and how did the team perform?
I think to zoom out from the task force level, I think as Aaron's describing all of his different, lines of effort there in the Poland piece, the thing that ties a lot of those together that we're learning back here in Germany as this is coming in is lessons learned on data management and data conditioning and other things, that, we're out there talking about reconnaissance and we're out there talking about security, but there's this whole piece of communication and making sure you have good data and conditioned data and data interoperability, not just with your own soldiers, but with your NATO partners, and then, with the Joint Force and the Navy in this situation. So I think a lot of great lessons learned on communicating and over what systems, and then overall that kind of helps us get at what are we doing here to make sure we're driving down, I think, the timeline for sensor to shooter operations, whether that's coming off something homegrown that Aaron's team built, or whether that's coming from our partners in the Navy and sensed off the water, or whether that's, threat identified by our defensive cyber folks.
Yeah, and I think another piece of this too, and this might get back to, some of the questions you've asked in terms of, well, how do you evaluate success? What did you do to evaluate that? So as with all things multi-domain operations and specifically multi-domain task force, there's a lot of generating things that traditional Army units have already kind of built for them. And one of those things is, the standard for whatever task you're doing. So for a lot of the tasks we're doing, there's not necessarily an established standard for what that is. In terms of, on the artillery as an example, right? There's a time standard based with fire mission received, round going out of the cannon downrange, and then a conditions-based standard in terms of where that round lands versus where they're aiming. So none of that data really exists for a lot of what we're doing. This will become kind of more germane when we get into the Fort Huachuca piece. But in terms of how we actually evaluate how well we're doing, I think we're still building what those criteria are and building kind of our own evaluation criteria, taking all the data collection and data movement pieces kind of operationally, like Tommy was saying, but then also using that data to evaluate our efficiency and effectiveness as a formation. And we still don't even really know what good looks like yet, as we're still kind of doing that data collection so that we can then further inform future iterations of this on what's, that was good. You did that fast. Was that faster or slower? Or we have no comparative data on that right now. And so I think that's part of the challenge too, is building that library so that we can use that in the future to assess, effectiveness and performance.
Yeah, I think that, that's an interesting point. This kind of longitudinal tracking as you guys, start to think about, hey, your own personal, PCS and moving on to the next thing. It's like, how do you keep track of this time over time, or exercise over exercise to evaluate, at level one, it's okay, did we accomplish the objective? Yes or no, right? Like mission achievement, very important. Then the second level is, all right, well, did we accomplish it as well, so as fast, as efficiently, as effectively as it could have been, or could it have been done more quickly? Could it have been done to greater effect? And kind of the only way to assess that is against some baseline, whether it's your own or full potential somewhere else. So I think that's kind of an interesting um, nugget for folks to consider is how are we benchmarking performance in these exercises and being really honest with ourselves, not just, hey, all right, it's passing grade because it worked. Like that's fine. But successful compared to what? Compared to what we did last time, compared to what we are capable of. And that kind of objective assessment seems like a really important piece to flesh out a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, that wasn't a question. That was just my riff. I was reflecting back what you guys said. So, okay, let's move on then to the CONUS portion, the Fort Huachuca portion of the exercise, and the kind of the long range kill chain element. Remind us kind of what was the attempt here? What were we trying to determine, and then how did you actually go about this portion of the exercise?
Yeah, sure. So for the CONUS piece of this, centered primarily on Fort Huachuca in Arizona. Really, from a capability standpoint, a few different things that we tried to bring in. So it was a medium HAB that was providing some level of station keeping. So it was doing some electromagnetic sensing at a fairly high altitude, partnered with and coupled with what we call micro HABs or tactical HABs in some environments, which is basically a smaller, shorter duration balloon that we also put a payload on. And then we had a smaller, I'd call it like a class 2 plus UAS that also had EW sensing payloads on it. And then we had a launched effect, and then we had a couple other things that we'd kind of wrapped around that to round out the capabilities that we have there. Now, there's kind of, unlike Poland, which was a little more, each of those situations that we talked to was kind of one-off. They weren't really integrated with each other. Everything that we did in Arizona was really part of a larger, not just experimentation exercise, but also a training exercise to validate that, one of our companies could actually run this. And so there was kind of two components to our evaluation out there, which was one, can the technology do the things that we want it to do? Two, then can the company actually do the command and control or mission command of those systems and then actually execute the tasks that we're giving them? And so throughout the risk reduction event / preparatory time, which was really us just saying, hey, can the sensor integrate with the platform? Can it tie into our mission command or C2 environment? And so we worked our way through all of that. And that basically is a fairly linear process. You go step 1 through step 5 and green everything up, and then you're ready to go. But then it's about how do you bring all that stuff together? Can you hit some of the technical objectives? One of our big ones was, how many different platforms and payloads can we use simultaneously to really provide an accurate geolocation of whatever threat we're going after? And so we were able to really push things forward on that front, especially when you contrast it with Arcane Thunder 24, which I think we told you previously was maybe not on paper a successful event, but very much, we had to go through that to get to the point that we got to now. And so for us, it was exciting because as we started to kind of go through the technical objectives, we realized we were going to actually start to knock some of these objectives down. So we were able to get multiple things in the air. We were able to do simultaneous sensing. I think the high count was a 9-ball geo, I think was the biggest one that we got, which basically just means we had 9 sensors simultaneously sensing on a singular threat, which was huge for us. One of the other big things for us was how many of these smaller, tactical micro HABs can you actually launch in a given day? I think, and don't quote me on this, but the Army record For the number launched in any single day, I think it was around 5, and we were able to get 10 of those launched in a single day. So in terms of our ability to actually execute the technology, hugely successful. And then as you kind of look at, say, okay, how did the company that we were evaluating, the company size formation, actually execute the missions inside of that? Then kind of a similar dynamic to what I described with our defensive cyber team, where we have these checklists and we just start to go through, yes, you did that, no, you didn't do that. And so that was interesting to see. And then I think one of the things we closed with our session with you last time with is there's not just technical objectives we're going after, there's organizational structure objectives. How are we arraying our forces? How are we configuring them? How are we creating different sections inside of that? And so being able to evaluate how we think we would actually function and fight as an organization. And that's a little more subjective in a sense, but being able to see how that played out and learn some lessons from that was huge. So across both the training and the experimentation and really the technical, it's kind of the 3 buckets, we saw huge progress and learned huge lessons across all 3 of those.
What do you think changes? First off, thanks for the laydown. I think it's an awesome kind of tour de force across what you all did and why it matters. And I guess now that you've seen what's possible there, between now and the next exercise, talk to us about the process of how do those learnings actually get adopted into, your day-to-day operations or training, or do you modify kind of any TTPs or the way that you all work as a result of what you saw in that exercise?
I mean, I think we're already back to the literal whiteboard/drawing board on where do we go from here, concept of employment-wise, where do we go from here, task organization, and I think that applies to everything from day-to-day ops to our next staff exercise to our next CPX, and then hopefully culminating at Arcane Thunder 26. But I think it's going to have us take a hard look at everything, and those conversations have already started. And I don't know, we'll draw it up again, and then we'll get to next year and hopefully refine it and get a little bit closer to getting it right.
Got it. So it's kind of continuing to push the envelope, but day to day, it's not. It's changing how you fight. Doesn't necessarily change kind of like how what you do on a day to day basis. Does that seem like a fair assessment, or am I oversimplifying?
I think that's fair, but I think the other thing that we're looking at too, and so actually we just did our after action review earlier this morning. And one of the big things that we want to start looking at for Arcane Thunder 26 and beyond, is, for the previous 3 exercises, there was some level of tactical, movement and army things going on inside of that, but there was still very much kind of an austere experimentation type environment. As we look at doing this in the future, how do we start to layer in fighting or training this like we would actually fight? So, employing our tactical vehicles, moving tactically, as you're doing these different activities, taking protection and survivability into account and starting to actually kind of move out of the startup phase and into the more of the warfighting phase, I think is going to be one of the big transitions for this organization over the next year or so. And the biggest piece of that is how you start to layer in some of these more basic soldier tasks on top of all of the things that we're trying to do.
Yep. Got it. That I think that's fair. I think it makes sense. When you all maybe if you think back to kind of, we just gone through a bunch of things, what do you think was totally unfair question? What do you think was the most important first for the MDTF, for the organization, for you guys out of this exercise?
Well, I think Tommy and I might each have kind of different perspectives on this, just kind of where we were in a fight. So the one for me, one of the biggest challenges we had in Arcane Thunder 24 was the network, and our ability to actually integrate all of these different payloads and have them all looking at the sensors, and being able to do that collaborative piece, being able to share that information across echelons from one location to the next, and our inability or the struggles that we had to really fight through that for Arcane Thunder 24, I think was in large part a predecessor to the success we saw in 25 because we focused on that problem set with a lot of institutional energy. And so our ability, and this really isn't even at my battalion level, at the task force level, the S6 shop in there, and then really in partnership with my signal company, figuring out how to build an architecture that can actually integrate all of these payloads, and then how can we share that information across all the different locations we had. And oh, by the way, all the locations we had were way more spread out than they were in Arcane Thunder 24. And so just as kind of a anecdote of success that we had on that, I was sitting in Poland in the battalion talk, and I'm getting live full motion video feeds from the sensors in Arizona as they're coming online. And so our ability to kind of streamline the network, integrate it into our cloud environment, and do all those different things was really not only the biggest first, but it was also the biggest success that really led to any other success that we had throughout the duration of the exercise, at least from my perspective.
No, I mean, I think that the network was a huge piece and a huge win. I mean, I think similar to what Aaron alluded to, now we're talking about commanding, controlling like 2 locations, on opposite sides of the world, on 2 continents. We got joint partners, we have multinational allies, and, all of us trying to figure out together, how do we process data faster? How do we turn that into usable information? And how do we then empower soldiers to take action with that? And I think all of the iteration on all this, as we learned those kind of lessons and got better and faster and quicker, I think that was a big win too from the task force perspective. All enabled by the network.
Awesome. Yeah. No, these are big things. I mean, it makes it's a big deal to see this all coming together. I know you guys got to feel really good about that. It's awesome. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I know this is for you guys kind of the capstone in some ways on your tour. Any advice for your successors who are stepping into these roles in just a few weeks here?
So I mean, it's a great question phrased that way. I think if we look at 25 and Arcane Thunder 25, and then we look at where do we want to go in 26. I mean, I think we know maybe day-to-day operations doesn't change, to go back to your other question, but I think we probably have a new roadmap for how do we get to 26 and how do we change maybe or do more of the campaigning and interim training events, and how do we then increase the complexity and the difficulty and the training value of everything that we do, so that we're getting something out of it and we're getting better, every day and every time we go out. And, I think if we're assessing, did we execute and get the training value of everything we planned? Like, yes, absolutely. So now, the grad level question is, so did we design it all the right way? And what would we tweak next time? And how do we get more out of it? I think it's just continuing to push forward, continuing to take a critical look back at yourself, and then, let's try something new and keep getting better.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, I think the training piece that Tommy mentioned was huge. The second big success in my mind beyond the network was our ability to build an actual deliberate training plan and progression from the individual all the way up to the collective and larger organization. One of the proudest successes and moments for me was that balloon launch that I talked about, where I went out and I saw the crew and they had all the commands down and they were doing it at the launch and the vendors were watching them and they were doing it like rapid fire, like balloon up, next balloon's prepped. And that was when I fully appreciated, just how powerful, being deliberate with our training is. So in terms of advice, it'd be like, just make sure that you continue to push the training piece of this. And I think as the second MDTF in particular has kind of matured, especially over these last 2 years, we're at the point now where the task force can start start to take some of those experimentation objectives off the battalion. And we saw that a little bit to a certain degree for Arcane Thunder 25, and really let the battalion commander, and this would be my advice to him, is, really focus on the training component of this. Look for ways to be creative with your training. Look for ways to continue getting your soldiers hands on equipment. And again, kind of going back to the, why do I need 3D printed UAS? Continue to push the boundary on that. We'll figure out kind of as a collective group what technologies to bring into the next Arcane Thunder. So that'd be advice number one. Number two, and this will kind of lead into just kind of like general thoughts on kind of where we're going writ large, but it's kind of a sophism, and I know you just kind of had your soft podcast, so I'll throw a shout out to that. But humans over hardware is a real thing, especially when it comes to the training piece. But then also, as we've kind of talked through too, how do you organize the humans that you have? Where do you put them? How do you actually execute command and control of them? I think one of my biggest lessons learned, not necessarily from failure in this one, but just kind of actually seeing it play out, is like, even in a ubiquitous sensor to shooter world where we're connecting all these different dots across the battle space, there is still room for empowered junior leaders to be able to execute within a commander's intent at really all levels. Like, there's always room for a leader who knows what his next higher boss his or her next higher boss wants to do, and feeling empowered to make decisions inside of that. Just because we're trying to connect any sensor to the best shooter, that doesn't mean that all of us are just drones out there moving things around on the battle space. There's absolutely room for empowered junior leaders, both from the officer side, but then particularly from the NCO side, and making sure, my advice would be, make sure that the NCOs and the junior officers of your formation feel empowered, and that you train them to actually operate inside of that decision space that's appropriate for them. Learn how to manage risk, learn how to put that risk up. And so really that would kind of cap off my second recommendation.
I love it. I think that's it's super well said, well thought out, and I think it's broader than even just your successors. I mean, it's for the broader kind of the joint force as well. These are I love the humans over hardware thing. I think we're starting to see just a general, maybe it's the urgency of this, but it's the willingness to not only to do the after action, which I know is kind of like a core part of military conduct, but to kind of share learnings in public, be honest about what's working, and kind of raise the flag where there are issues, and also to kind of think about a little bit of competition as a form of assisting with things like acquisition, and kind of pushing each other to be better. So I think these are exciting trends, and hopeful that they will only accelerate some of these modernization efforts. Gentlemen, we've covered a lot of ground. You guys have shared a ton. Super grateful. Closing thoughts for your command, for the broader ecosystem, for our audience as we look to wrap here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is a great lead-in, but in terms of what do we want the larger audience to take away, I mean, I do think that if nothing else, on top of all the wins that Aaron's mentioned, right, I think we've proven that this is a viable sandbox to come in and test out, and we know what we want in the sensor and what I want in the long duration, UAS platform, or in a launched effect, or in a high altitude platform, and maybe we have at least a baseline, if not the standard yet. But you're right. Like, I think this is the competition venue to come in and let's, how far can it go? How long can it operate? At what distance can I sense from? How long's your battery? And I mean, I think this is a very viable environment to come and start seeing some of that competition.
Amen. All right, guys. I got nothing else. Anything else you guys want to share before we wrap?
No, I think we're good. Again, no, just appreciate your time. Letting us suck down 2 podcast episodes. Yeah. Jury's still out on if that was a good move for you or not, but
yeah, if you don't count the soft one as the first time return guests on Crossing the Valley.
There you go. No, I love it. I think the door is absolutely open for folks who want to do before and after, and who are willing to be super honest about, about kind of things that they try and reflect on what works and what didn't. I think it's a great place for us to take the show, and accountability is important, and building in public and being reflective about all that so others can learn from it learn from it, excuse me, is a real gift. So thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate everything. Best of luck in your next tours, and we'll look forward to maybe having you on in another capacity here in the future.
All right, sounds good.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Noah.
Thanks, guys.